Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ready, Set, Grow. We're going to talk about vegetable gardening in ground and also in containers. I'm Rosie Smith, and I'm the Ag Program Coordinator for Wazoo Extension, Snohomish County. So I'm going to show some slides and then I have brought some examples of different kinds of containers and different kinds of fertilizer and potting soils and transplants. So we'll go to the classroom cameras after the slides and look at all that. Okay. So we'll get started. Why grow in small spaces and or containers? It's efficient use of space. You can usually plant things closer, so get more food production out of a smaller space. You can use containers to enhance flat and boring areas or block potential eyesores. You can add food to your plantings. I have a flower bed in front of our house that I always add Swiss chard plants to just because they're super pretty. I need some good recipes for Swiss chard because sometimes I don't actually harvest it and it just grows and looks good. But you can add, food plants really readily. When you're growing in small spaces and containers, you want to use vertical space because you don't have the horizontal space, and we'll talk about that later. Containers specifically, so this is raised beds, it's different kinds of pots and containers made out of different materials. It can make gardening more accessible for those with physical challenges, as the gardening level is usually raised up a bit higher. It helps to eliminate competition from other plants and can reduce accessibility of many garden pests and diseases. It can add a focal point of color or a tasty little snack area. I have a big pot close to our front door that I plant a currant tomato, which currant tomatoes are as big as your thumbnail. They're tiny little cherry tomatoes that are delicious. And then my household can just walk out the door and eat some tomato snacks, which is super, super handy and healthy. Growing in containers, you can isolate the treatment of pests and diseases if your containers aren't too big, that you can actually move them. And if the containers are not super heavy, you can actually move them to follow the sun or protection from weather, put them under an eave. I have some containers in front of our house that I put in the garage in the winter if it's going to freeze hard, just to keep the plants in them from getting damaged. So getting started, these are the things that you need in different amounts for being successful growing in small spaces. So we'll talk about location. We'll talk about the amount of sun that comes up as a question. Different containers, so different sizes, what they're made of, the growing medium. So if you're not growing in soil in a small space, like right in a little garden, what the potting medium is like when you're growing in containers. How much water do things need and when? Nutrients, when you're growing in small spaces and containers, you have to be more aware because there's less volume of soil that you're growing in to make sure that your crop plants are getting enough nutrients. What kinds of crops and different varieties. Now there's all sorts of compact plants like zucchinis and cucumbers and things that used to be really big and sprawly, which do really well in smaller spaces and containers, and then the care. So first thing to think about is, where is your sunshine? Most annual veg needs at least 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. Some things, not very many though, you can grow in 4 or 5 hours of sunlight, but most things need a good amount of sunlight a day. So when you're looking at where you're going to plant, so either a little garden space or in containers, you sort of want to assess that before you start your garden just to make sure you're getting enough direct sunlight. Location, I like this picture that I found. It's a window box and it has different kinds of radicchio, herbs, lettuce. So you can grow a lot of different things in a small space. You can grow food just about anywhere. Borders, on your deck, like in a big container, on balconies, anywhere you have a bit of space, you can definitely grow some food. Again, 6 to 8 hours of sun for warm season crops. Warm season crops are those grown in the summer, like that like heat, tomatoes, eggplants, basil, things like that. You'd need 4 to 5 hours of sun for cool season crops, which are usually called shoulder season, which is March through about June and maybe September through end of October. You need access to water, so that's an important one. I find the spaces, I have one big strawberry bed that is a bit of a walk away from my main garden, and a lot of times I neglect to water it just because it's far enough away that I don't think of it, or it's more energy to get the water there. Be careful of microclimates. Sometimes microclimates can work to your favor. For instance, we had a nice little peach tree at home up against a south wall. And so the sun in the spring would hit that wall and reflect off of it, and it would warm the soil and warm up the area and that tree. Peaches don't typically do very well in Western Washington, but it did really great in that microclimate. You could also, it could be a negative if you have, say, a concrete paved area that can really absorb the summer heat and reflect it back. And sometimes that's too much for crops that don't like to be super warm. If you're planting in containers, know that drainage water can stain concrete. And this is just a little factoid. A 20-inch container filled with plants and moist growing medium can be 100 pounds. So containers filled with soil with plants can get really heavy quick. Yes, question.
So someone who lives in the UK, they said they struggle to get a lot of sunlight. What are your suggestions for that?
So we're going to talk about that. Someone just asked if you're in an area that doesn't get a lot of sunlight, you can literally use reflective materials or mirrors to enhance the amount of light in a given space. And I think I have a slide on that a little bit later. If you're in a shady space with, a lot of surrounding trees, or the sun's just not getting to the space where you want to plant, there's some herbs and some leafy greens that they do okay in partial shade, but most things unfortunately need a few hours of direct sun. That's a good question. Okay, let's talk about raised beds. So this photo is a little raised bed garden at the Evergreen State Fairgrounds that I plant every year. You can see it's just made of landscape blocks, and they're a few feet tall, so it makes it nice to like weed and plant because I'm not, bending over to the ground. And this little garden is really great for crops that like hot weather in the summer because of all the concrete. So there's concrete like driveways on two sides of it, and so it gets really warm. So the tomatoes and the peppers and most things do really great in this. There's also, as you can see, a trellis, that circular arch that goes between the two beds, that I plant cucumbers and pole beans on. And by August, That is just a big green half circle that people can walk under. So that's an example of growing vertically using the vertical space to complement your growing area. And then on the left side is a half a wine barrel, and that is full of herbs that do really well. There's thyme and sage, and I believe there's a chive plant in that. So you don't need that much space to grow things really productively. So having soil a few inches or more higher, like in this example or in a container, helps with extra rooting depth. And we're going to talk particularly about carrots because carrots need a deeper depth just because they grow longer. But there's new varieties of carrots. Well, some of them aren't very new that are either they're ball shaped or they're like half the length of a regular carrot. And I've grown them both and they're delicious. So those are super handy when you don't have the rooting depth. It having things raised up can increase the soil temperatures. So you can plant things a little bit earlier in the spring, helps the soil drain, and you can make raised beds out of just about anything. This particular example is landscape blocks, but I've seen them made from wood, from all kinds of different things. You just don't want to use any materials that have toxic substances in them. So don't use railway ties, things like that that might give off chemicals that your plants would take up. Talking about containers on the left, those are beets growing in that's like a livestock tote. You can buy them at local feed stores, and it's quite large. I think that one's maybe a 10-gallon. And then on the right, I visited Jennings Garden in Marysville, Washington, and the master gardeners have a container garden part of their food garden. And this bed, so the master gardener was holding up the beans. Those are Royal Burgundy beans. So the beans are actually purple, super easy to see and harvest because they're not green like the rest of the plant. And this bed was made of found materials, bricks, concrete, slabs, big rocks. And it was very cool. You couldn't tell what it was made out of because the beans were sort of flopping over, growing over the sides. But I thought that was pretty cool that the whole thing was made out of found materials. So you don't have to buy expensive containers. You can use what you have. And I brought some containers that we'll look at once we get through the slides that are made of different materials, and we'll talk about each of those and the benefits and some of the drawbacks. So containers for vegetable plants must be big enough to support plants when they're fully grown and mature. So you can see in the picture, those are tomatoes growing in 5-gallon buckets. They hold soil without spilling, have adequate drainage. So any container that you use needs to have good drainage. So you might have to put some extra holes in the bottom. Like these red pails, for instance, probably didn't have drainage holes, so they either cracked the bottom or drilled some holes into them. And of course, containers that have never held substances that would have been toxic. Even if the substance isn't in the container, there can still be residual that plant roots can take up. On the right, that photo is a zucchini plant that's growing vertically. I'd never seen that. And it was just 2 pieces of metal tubing driven into the raised bed. And then they tied the zucchini plant up as it grew. And it was great because it kept the zucchinis off the ground. So there was less slug damage. And they were just using bits of like strips of t-shirts, which I thought was pretty ingenious too. So the growing medium, so this is either the soil in your little garden space or like a potting mix, and we'll talk more about that. It must be porous because the roots require both air and water, and it must provide nutrients and be a physical support to grow healthy plants and have good drainage as well. You can buy potting mixes with slow release fertilizer in them, which is handy if you don't want to be fertilizing over the season. And we'll talk about fertilizing in a minute. And you can also buy growing mediums like potting mixes that are the perfect pH for growing vegetables. And I brought some with me today that we're going to look at shortly. So for garden soil, and this is a picture in my home garden, you can see how many rocks and pebbles are in that soil. It's very gravelly. And so what I do is I try to add compost every year, like even, half an inch, and it really helps with adding nutrients and lightening the soil. And that's a big slug eating a lettuce plant, which, in the garden, you'll probably have some pests finding it. So you have to kind of scout around and look at your plants to make sure they're growing well. For containers, you don't want to use 100% garden soil if possible. If I used this soil in the photo in my containers, it would get really compact quick. Although it holds water and nutrients well, it holds water very well. And so you might have some root rot issues because the drainage isn't as good as if there was potting mix or compost mixed in. Also, using garden soil, you can introduce diseases, pests, and weed seeds present. So one of my big pots, I think I had a tomato in it last year. I used maybe half garden soil, and it had some slug eggs in it because I didn't see any slug trails, but there were slugs inside the pot. So you just have to be aware that can happen. And using garden soil, it can be really heavy. So clay garden soil consists, so this is the opposite of the soil in my garden. It consists of extremely small particles. You don't see a lot of rocks and gravel. In a container, the undesirable qualities of clay are worse. It holds a ton of moisture when it's wet, and it compacts because those small particles sort of glom together. And then when it gets dry, it cracks and it can pull away from the sides of the pot when dry. So if you're using some clayish garden soil, you always want to mix it with compost or some commercial growing medium. So, and I have some examples of this I'll show you. Let's talk about commercial soilless mixes. So these actually don't have soil in them. They're a mix of like peat, other lightweight materials, and then typically compost and nutrients and other things. And you can buy them as organic, so they don't have any synthetic chemicals in them as well. There's all different types. If you go to a garden store, usually they have like many different kinds to choose from. Typically, they're lightweight, they drain well, they hold water well, and they have nutrients, so that's going to feed your plants. Generally, they're free of weeds, insects, and diseases. When you buy them, they have an optimal pH. So typically in Western Washington, our garden soils, so the soils that just exist outside, are quite acidic from all the rain that we get, all the precipitation we get. And in growing vegetables, gardeners and farmers typically have to add some lime to sweeten the soil or increase the pH to closer to neutral, because the more acidic a soil gets, the less available the nutrients are for the crop plants to take up. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Yes, question.
So someone is thinking of using garden bags. Will they work well, and should they use some stones for drainage?
So garden bags, like the bags that you fill up with soil and then plant into, you can buy these they're like fabric bags, and you fill them with soil, and then you plant your plants into that. I've done that with peppers before and potatoes, and they grew really well. So the question was, do you want to put rocks
Yeah, public training.
to help with drainage? Yeah, I mean, that's all part of our conversation a little bit later is what do you put in the bottom of your containers? Those fabric bags, I don't think you have to put anything. Once they're full of soil, it kind of fills out that space and they maintain that space integrity just with the fabric. Um, it takes a lot of soil to fill them though, or growing media. So some folks will put sticks or twigs. I'm going to talk about a raised bed that I have that I filled with firewood, the bottom foot of it, and then added 2 feet of soil on top of that. It depends if you're going to move the soil bags and how much rooting depth you have. So you definitely can put rocks or something in the bottom to reduce the amount of soil that you need, but you just want to make sure that you have enough rooting depth for whatever plant you're putting in them. Yeah, that's a good question. We're going to follow up on that. Okay, we'll keep moving along. So as we were just talking about, for a large container, the expense of prepackaged or soilless mixes may be high. And so you might want to make your own. And I have a couple of recipes for you. And literally, that would be buying the peat moss and the fertilizer and the perlite and then mixing it in a big pot or a wheelbarrow just to cut down on the expense. Although now you can buy these, they're called bales of soil. And I think it's 5 or 6 cubic feet. And when you take it out of the bag, it also puffs up. So you get more. But there's different ways of filling your containers. So other mixtures for container vegetables, and the photo on the top right, that's one of those bales, sunshine mix. I used to use that when I was a farmer. I think it's 6 cubic feet, but it's just peat and that sunshine mix for is peat moss and perlite. Perlite are those little tiny white balls that you see in potting mix, and they help with drainage. So they add porosity to the soil mix and make it easier for the roots to grow. So you can mix 25% garden soil and 75% compost. You can also buy compost in bags or in bulk from garden centers, or you can make your own, but that's a whole nother class. You could use 25% soilless mix, so buy potting mix and add another quarter garden soil and then 50% compost and others. So there's a lot of different ways of filling up your raised beds in your containers and or adding to your garden soil. Like my garden soil isn't very good at home, so every year I add a bit of compost. I'm also lucky to have some livestock, so we do compost at home, and then I use that in the garden to help with productivity. So do I need fertilizer? While vegetables get most of the fertilizers they need from compost, a complete organic fertilizer can give plants a boost, or if they're heavy feeders. So things like tomatoes and peppers, they need you have to make sure they have enough nutrients to be productive. So I add compost to those containers as well, but then I will give them a bit of fish fertilizer in the summer when they're in the phase of forming fruit and producing fruit. So on the left is a picture of just all-purpose fertilizer. There's many, many, many variations of this as well that you can purchase, liquid or prilled, like in a powder form. And the numbers, so 10, 10, 10, Those are the percentages by weight of each of the macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that are contained in the package. So macronutrients are sort of the most important nutrients that plants need to grow and thrive. Nitrogen is mostly for above ground growth. Phosphorus is for underground growth or root growth. And then potassium is more for all over growth. And different plants have different needs, but a good general all-purpose fertilizer definitely won't harm your plants and give them a bit of a boost, or if they're heavy feeders. So for example, that bag, 10, 10, 10, means that in a 10-pound, I think it's a 10-pound bag, 1 pound of that would be nitrogen, 1 pound would be phosphorus, and 1 pound would be potassium. And the remaining 7 pounds would just be inert ingredients or filler. Anyway, sometimes folks get confused about that. So you'll also see fertilizers specifically for, say, tomatoes, and they would have different numbers, like a 511 or something. Anyways, just read the packages and look at the back on where it says how to apply it, and that will give you all the information that you need. So let's talk about crop selection. Most veggies that grow in a typical backyard garden also do well in a container, with a few important things to keep in mind. So this was a Romanesco zucchini that I grew in a pot, and it did really well, but I only got typically container variety vegetables. They're not quite as productive as a garden variety veg. So veggies and herbs that are suited for container gardening are everything on that list plus more. The picture, those are called Parisian market carrots, and they're really great in containers or raised beds. A lot of carrots will grow to be, 8 to 10 inches long. And so you need a lot of soil depth to get, a good carrot in that situation. And so there's different varieties of carrots in particular that do really well in shallow soils. And this is one of them. You can also grow fruits and berries. On the right is a raspberry that's been developed for growing in a container. Again, you're not going to get as many raspberries probably as a big old, garden variety, but they'll still be productive and taste good. Dwarf varieties, and I brought some today to show you. They often mature and bear fruit early, but you don't get as much yield as standard varieties. And the amount of sun that your container receives may determine which crops can be grown. So root and leaf crops can tolerate partial shade. Fruit generally needs at least 6 hours of full direct sunlight each day. And fruit being, there are now varieties of apple trees and different fruit trees that are on dwarfing rootstock, so they stay quite small. So you can grow them in a big pot or container. And we talked about this a little bit before. That was a good question. Light can be increased by providing reflective materials and also moving the pot. So you can buy these little, it's like what would it be? It's like a little tray on wheels. And unless your pot's super big and heavy, you can put your pot. I had a friend that actually had her pots on these little wheelie things, and she would move her tomatoes from one side of her deck to the other every day. I mean, it was, she really wanted good tomatoes because the sun would shift on her deck. And so she would follow the sun by moving her plants. Anyways, there's different ways of providing more light using techniques like that. So Botanical Interests is a seed company, and they have all kinds of container varieties. So I thought this one looked good. I haven't grown this one. It's called Patio Choice. So if you ever see, words like compact or patio or container, typically those have been developed for growing in smaller spaces. These are pole beans and they're growing on a trellis. And I've seen, like in that former picture, the zucchinis and cucumbers that you just grow them up. So instead of them growing out horizontally over the ground, because you don't have that space, you grow them up, which is great. Okay. Tomatoes in containers. So that is a 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot container. My predecessor in this position, she is an amazing tomato grower. And so containers typically are the larger is better, especially when you're growing tomatoes. And they need consistent watering, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, depending on the size of the container. So you might want to get a timer. You always want to use high quality planting media. And if you replant in that same pot, you want to either add more compost or take some of the last year's soil media out and refresh it. So don't reuse more than half. Definitely feed more frequently. So you'll need to get some liquid or otherwise the powdered fertilizer because these plants can be super productive and something that's going to support it because tomatoes in containers, even though you do prune them or can prune them, they can really fill out an area. So this particular tomato was a stupichka, which is a nice little sort of a slicing tomato with really nice flavor. And she was getting 1 to 2 pounds per week starting in mid-July. So you can see the plant in the middle with the tomatoes hanging. They're all green and just developing. And then later on in the season, the tomato plant wasn't looking so great, but still had a lot of production. And she got 13 pounds of tomatoes from that 1 foot cubed container, which is pretty amazing. But she also said she had to water it a lot, multiple times a day in the heat of the summer, and consistently fertilize to ensure that that plant was getting enough nutrients. So some examples, this is back in the Jennings garden in Marysville. They were using horse waters, or I guess they could be cattle waters, livestock waters, as planting beds with all kinds of different crops, beans, lettuce. You can see in some of the names, like the cucumbers, salad, bush, hybrid, that like typically cucumbers are really, they grow on a long vine. And so when you see the word bush, that means it stays compact. Space Master also indicates that it's going to be a smaller plant. All kinds of things. Peppers, radishes do great in containers. Different kinds of squash. I found one that I brought today that I'll show you, and it is called baby bush zucchini. I grew one last year and I only got 3 zucchinis off of it, but it was still productive. And then there's all kinds of tomatoes as well. And when I was out shopping for my tomato plants this spring, I even saw some that were like they were supposed to be used in baskets, hanging baskets, which I thought was pretty cool. So you plant your basket, hang it up, and then the tomatoes sort of cascade over the side. This picture is a big old livestock water that had rusted out. And I thought, well, you can't use it for livestock anymore, but we could plant some strawberries in it. So that's a new strawberry bed. And this particular container, it's pretty big. That's a lot of soil to fill it up. So we filled the bottom like foot height with firewood and sticks and leaves and things that are going to compost down and decompose over time. So this bed, um, this was this was 2 years ago that we planted it. So this year, it's already, the soil has gone down a bit, the level. So there's quite a bit of space between the top of the soil level and the edge of the container. And so next week, or sorry, next year, this year we're just going to let them grow. The plants have loads of strawberries on them, harvest those. And then next spring or in the winter, we'll pull up the strawberries. We're going to renovate that bed, add more compost, get the soil level up again, because all that wooden stuff has been decomposing, and eventually it's just going to keep on. The soil will keep moving downward, and so we'll refill it and then replant the strawberries. You can get compact blueberries. Like I said, apples on dwarfing rootstocks. I had an apple tree in I think it was it wasn't a very big pot, 5 gallon um, pot, and it grew very well. Some exceptions are blackberries and certain hybrid berries because they are super vigorous and they just grow like crazy and they're hard to contain even in a big container. So planting your containers, or if you're planting in a regular garden, it all goes in at the same time. You want to fill your containers or your raised beds or pots, sow your seeds or plant your seedlings. Remember to leave a bit of space. So when you water, it's not going to run over the side of your container. Make sure you label, especially if you're sowing seeds, and then gently water. And you want to be careful when you water baby plants and seeded areas, because if you use a heavy stream of water, it can dislodge them, the seeds and the little plants. So just be gentle with that. There's my cat helping me out in my hoop house, and you can see in the back. So the pot that she's standing beside, that's actually a melon plant that I tried growing in a container, and it became a jungle. So this year I have my melon plants beside the edge of the hoop house. And then in the back, I planted tomatoes and peppers in various sized black plastic pots, and they absolutely loved it and were super productive. So don't need a lot of space to get good production. You want to check regularly because the volume of soil in containers or pots is relatively small and the containers can dry out really quickly. So you have to check a bit more than you would in a garden situation. Daily or multiple times a day, especially in the summer, is needed. We had a super hot day here on Wednesday, and I had watered all my pots in this little hoop house included in the morning, and by that evening, because it was really hot that day, I had to rewater some of them because they were already dried out. Make sure the water runs out through the drainage holes. Some folks, they water, but they don't water enough, and the water will only go down maybe halfway through the pot. And then what happens is the roots of that plant, they're going to grow where the water is. So they're not going to sort of grow to their potential because they're staying where the water line is. So you want to make sure that you water enough that it comes out of the drainage holes. And clay pots, there's all kinds of different materials, pots that you can plant in. Clay pots allow additional evaporation from the sides of the pot. So that's just something to be aware of when you're planting. Another tip is to group pots together. So the foliage helps create a canopy, and that helps shade the soil and keeps the soil cool. So in this picture, there's some herbs in the front, and then not sure what that plant is, probably a squash plant. You can see is helping to shade the others, and a tomato on the right. So putting your pots together helps cut down on watering as well. Make sure you check your containers on windy days because the wind can evaporate moisture away. And mulching the tops of your pots around the plants can help conserve water too. And that's, you don't really want to use sawdust because sawdust, the microorganisms in the soil that do decomposition and help, what do they do? They help, when they decompose organic materials, they create plant available nitrogen. And if you put sawdust or wood chips in that situation, they use the nitrogen to actually decompose the woody material. So you want to use things like straw or leaves or things like that. And if you're away, consider getting a neighbor to come over or installing an automatic water system because, you know, in one super hot day, your pots can all get dried out and you want to just make sure they have consistent moisture. So let's talk about fertilizing. You definitely don't want to add more than the recommended rate of fertilizer. So the plant on the right has been over fertilized, and you can see the leaves are damaged. They look dried out. It's kind of wilty, too much fertilizer. And there's all kinds of different fertilizers, liquid. I'll show you a couple. Powdered ones. They come with all different amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So the best thing is to look if you're fertilizing vegetables is to look for a vegetable fertilizer and then read the box and apply as instructed. If your plants are little, like young little transplants, you might want to only fertilize them at a half rate until they get to their mature size. Just don't add too much. General care, you want to periodically inspect for presence of foliage feeding and fruit feeding insects, as well as diseases. You can see some of the pots and containers in this little garden. This is back at Jennings Master Gardener Garden. They have this floating row cover, so that white cotton material and or mesh covers. And those are excluding the bugs that want to eat those vegetables. And so there's different ways of keeping bugs away from your plants, but just looking at them and seeing if anything's chewing on them is all part of it as well. And you want to protect your crop plants from very high heat. So at the beginning, we were talking about growing on concrete. If you have containers and pots on concrete, a lot of times that can really heat up in the summer on sunny, warm days, and then it reflects it back. And so some folks, they'll move their containers to the edge of the concrete so they're not, you know, right in the middle. You can put cardboard or something around the containers if you know it's going to be super, super hot so that the sun it's hitting the cardboard and not the concrete. There's different ways of protecting your plants from getting super hot and heat damaged. And if you know there's going to be severe weather like hail or windstorms, if your containers aren't too heavy, you could potentially move them to a sheltered location under a eave, in a garage, or even just cover them. So I tend to plant my tomatoes outside in containers in May, and sometimes the weather isn't the best. We get these big rainstorms. And so sometimes I'll show you a tomato trellis. I'll literally put a plastic grocery bag over the top of it just to keep the raindrops from pounding that little tomato plant. And then once the sun comes back out, then I take the plastic bag off. It doesn't look super aesthetically friendly, but it works. So crop rotation, this is a concept of sustainable ag to control diseases and pests of related plants, it's always good to move them around. So if you have a pot that you're growing tomatoes in one year, you might want to grow a different plant family like beans or a cucumber or winter squash or lettuce and radishes the next year. And what this does is it avoids exhausting the soil of nutrients from a specific crop. And if there were any kind of pest issues, the pests will go to that pot and they'll be like, hey, where are the beets this year? So it's kind of confuses the pest species as well. And you can look up crop rotations on the internet. There's a lot of information about those. Succession planting is growing crops one after another. So planting in succession. And typically this is done with food crops that grow and mature quickly, like for instance, radishes. Some radishes you can plant them and you can harvest them 30 days later. They have like a 28-day life cycle. And so those are great for just putting in little spaces that are open and you get, more food production. So for example, in the picture, that's lettuce. The tall stuff in the center is a little bit older, and then you can see some baby lettuces that have germinated not that long ago, closer to the bottom of the picture. So plant lettuce in your tomato pots or something that's going to grow bigger and take up the space, but you'll have been able to get a crop before the other crop, like say if you had lettuce with beans, you could harvest your lettuce before the beans start getting big and crowding them out. Good old radishes fit in anywhere. Repotting, you might want to put perennials. Perennials are plants that grow from year to year to year. Annuals are plants that you grow, they complete their life cycle in one season. So if you have, like this pot had a lavender plant in it. Lavender is a nice herb to have and pollinators love it. You just want to take it out of the pot, clean the pot, loosen the roots. And so you can see there's roots in between that person's fingers. The roots start growing on the outside, like near the inside of the pot. Trim those, so break them up and trim them a bit. You can put the plant back into the same pot. Whoops, sorry. And just give it some new soil. So you're adding nutrients, and the plant will keep growing and thrive in that space. Vegetables in small spaces. This is another raised bed at Jennings Park. So there's peppers in the back of that bed and kale and mustard greens in the front. You want to make sure you think about plant selection. So thinking of varieties that are going to fit well in those small spaces. Suitable containers, making sure there's nothing toxic, and also thinking about size of containers and how much work you want to put into it. So say you have a 20-gallon container with a tomato, that's going to take a lot less watering and fertilizing than in a 1 foot by 1 foot container. You always want to have good planting media and water consistently, especially when it's hot in the summer. And then think about the location of where you're going to plant and also how much sun that you'll get. I love planting herbs in containers. I think this is on the left, that's the smallest pot I've ever grown herbs in. I think it was like 3 cups of soil. And we grew a thyme plant. Well, we grew multiple, but we had a thyme plant in that pot because everybody can use more thyme, right? And it did really well. We harvested multiple times from it. Other examples are basil, chives, parsley. Some of them come back, like rosemary, thyme, act as perennials in our climate and area. On the right side of that picture, that's called an herb spiral. And it's literally it looks like a snail shell, a spiral of concrete bricks. And then you plant herbs that like drier, warmer soil at the top, like rosemary, maybe lemon verbena. And then at the bottom, as you go down the spiral, then you plant plants that like cooler, moisture soil. So things like oregano and basil. Well, maybe not basil. Basil likes warm soil as well, but chives, things like that. So that's a good way to use a small space and grow a bunch of different herbs. Also using that vertical space. So the picture on the left, those are zucchinis that are being grown vertically. I'm going to try that in my own garden this year. And on the right, those are cucumbers. And that trellis was about 5 feet tall. So this was in September. So the cucumber plants were already growing up above and beyond the top of that trellis. And it was very productive. So that was pretty cool to see. But you can, use walls, fences, all kinds of things. This year I planted my melons in containers beside the side of my hoop house, and I'm going to let them grow out into the grass outside of my hoop house. So the roots of the melon plant, they like to be warm, and they will be in my toasty hoop house in July and August. And then the fruits will be outside on the vines. And so that's a way of using, I'm more or less using horizontal space. I've never grown melons on a vertical trellis, but I've heard it can be done. Winterization, in that picture, the big blue pot on the left is usually a tomato pot that's by my front door. And so people can just, have a little snack when they're coming in and out. Although I did plant some tulips in it last year. I found these really beautiful tulips. And so I need a new pot to grow my house tomato in this year. The center pot is just an ornamental, pretty vining plant. And then on the right, blue pot, and those are all, so the two on the right are ceramic pots that I got for free from neighbors, which is awesome. And the one on the left is a big plastic pot. They don't move very far because they're pretty heavy. The bottom right pot had herbs in it, and I transplanted those to a different part of the yard, and that also had tulips in it. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to plant in there this spring, but you can change things up easily. In the winter, you want to inspect your plants, especially if they're perennial. So if you have lavender plants or thyme plants, look at them, make sure nothing's eating them. You can prune out dead foliage or branches that aren't looking so good, and maybe turn the pots. This set of pots is in sort of a little alcove at the front of our house. And so even just turning them a half way, if I have things growing in there, would help that vegetation because they would just be getting sunshine from the little snail ornament, that rock ornament in the middle. That's where the sun comes from. And so turning the pots is just good practice. And in the winter, I typically put a bunch of leaves on top of the pots, just on top of the soil, to reduce erosion and keep the soil in the pot, because it rains pretty hard where we are. So, do we have any questions to this point? I'm going to go to the cameras next and show you a bunch of things. And so feel free to ask questions at that time too. Okay, can we go back to cameras? Okay, so I'm going to quickly get this out of the way here.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Is a greenhouse better? Not sure versus what, but probably just a good option.
So in our climate in the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot of gray days in the winter and spring, and it doesn't really start warming up until, and we won't use this year as an example, until usually May. And so the rule is to plant your garden after Mother's Day. This year's been a bit wonky because the weather's been all over the place. It was super hot on Wednesday. Now it's cold and rainy. And so the plants don't know what to do. So I've always grown my hot crops. So tomatoes, basil, peppers, eggplant, um, under a plastic cover because it creates a little greenhouse effect. My hoop house does not have electricity in it, so it's not heated. Greenhouses, by definition, can be really expensive to keep warm. And so a lot of folks around here just use plastic covers, and they can be little, like this big over a crop, or mine is big enough that I can stand in it. But it really helps contain the heat. And so my tomatoes and peppers do really well. So it's like a production aid. Yeah, especially in the spring, when it's cool. Okay, so let's talk about some things that we would need for gardening. I always bring some tools, and honestly, this spoon is my favorite planting tool, scratching up the soil. You can use anything. You don't need to buy super fancy things. A pair of scissors is great for pruning, trimming, and then you can also buy, these are, yeah, what are these called? They're flower snips. They're good for like little, like if you're pruning tomatoes. And then these are a little bit bigger, secateurs, for more like maybe lavender, pruning lavender, woodier stems. A trowel is great to have, but again, I use my spoon quite often. And this one has graduations, so you know how far down you're going into the soil. This is one of my favorite tools. It's called a hori hori. It's a Japanese gardening knife. It's serrated on one side, so you can cut things. I can harvest vegetables with it, dig, do all kinds of things. It's great. Having some sort of weeding tool is good. This is a Japanese weeding knife, so it has a really sharp blade here, and it's really great for just scratching around in pots and in my garden. And then this is just a little garden rake thing. And that was, I don't know if I bought that or not. Anyways, there's all kinds of tools you can compile and get, but having a couple sturdy tools is great. We'll talk about containers. So I brought all sorts of containers with me, different sizes and materials. So wood is great. Again, you don't want to use treated wood if you're growing food in it. This one, I think it had strawberries in it. I can't remember, but you can see there's a drainage hole. And when I water goes out the seams, and you can kind of see there's a bit of a space between the bottom and the side. So that's good drainage. This is let me move this over here. It's made out of like fibers, so like cardboard. And these are really good. I grew peppers in these one year, and it's fairly large. But eventually the bottom usually decomposes and rots out. So these are good, sustainable, because, eventually it's all going to decompose, but just know it's not going to last for a really long time. This I had herbs in. It's like a little shallow herb bowl, and there are, let me get this, maybe. Nope, won't come out. You can get trays too for underneath. So you set this in a tray, and that will collect water when you water it, and then it will absorb it back. This is getting a little bit small though. You'd have to water it a lot and probably add nutrients. Different sizes. There's plastic. There's a plastic pot. Actually, these are all plastic pots. They're lightweight, and these are more utilitarian, but you can buy them. They look quite nice as well. This is an interesting pot in that it has like a bottom in it that catches water. And then sometimes there's like water in the in the very bottom of this, which is okay. If you were to have, we could plant this with herbs or put a few veg in. So there's all kinds of different pots, different sizes, shapes, um, all the things. I brought this pot. Our neighbor, I inherited a blueberry and it came in this pot. So it had been living in this pot for many years and was thriving. You know, there's a tray in the bottom of this. Let me see if I can get it out. Yep. So this is one of the trays you'd put underneath a pot to catch the water. So this pot had a big old blueberry. I think the blueberry was probably 4 feet tall, very robust. And I inherited this, so I ended up planting the blueberry into the ground in the garden, and it's doing very well. But I kept the pot because I thought that might be a good, I mean, it doesn't look beautiful, but it's functional. It would make a really nice tomato pot. And you can see there's pretty big holes in the bottom. So in that case, you might want to put something in front of those holes, like a piece of cardboard, or you could put rocks in the bottom. It depends on how, if you care how heavy your pot's going to be and where you're going to put it. But if you're watering, you know some of your soil mix or soil media is going to drain out of those as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. You can buy ceramic pots. This one does not have a hole in the bottom. And so you'd want to get, you have to use a ceramic drill bit, but you could punch some holes in the bottom for drainage. Drainage is really important. And these conserve water really well because water can't get out of the material. Clay pots, on the other hand, you water them, you know, as you do. This one has a drainage hole in the bottom. But the clay can evaporate moisture. And so these ones need probably to be watered more often, just because of that evaporation potential. Okay, let's talk about seeds. Well, let's talk about soil mix first, and then we'll get to our planting and our seeds. So there's all different kinds, as you can see, of potting mix, which you can mix with garden soil. Some of them come with fertilizer, some don't. I just brought whatever I had in my garage. This one is called natural and organic seedling mix. So I probably started some veggie starts in this. And as you know, it can be confusing because there's so many kinds and mixes of this and that, and they're organic, and some have, like this one has fertilizer in it, but not much. 0.13 nitrogen, 0.04 phosphorus, and 0.13, sorry, that was potassium in the middle, and 0.13 phosphorus, NPK phosphorus. No, potassium on the end. It's NPK. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Just, you know, take a look at them all, and depending on what you're growing and where you're growing it, you might want to, you know, buy a soil mix that has some fertilizer in it. It's really based on your preference and what you're growing. There's all kinds of different soils. And then there's also all kinds of different fertilizers. This is it's called Super Thrive. It's 444, and it has pictures of tomatoes and flowers on it. So it's just a general fertilizer. This is powder form. And so this one you just sprinkle and you can dig it into the soil. And you can plant it, you can put it on when you're planting the plants. This one is fish fertilizer, and it's very smelly, but it's really good for your plants. And this one you mix in water and then apply it. And so I fertilize my tomatoes, some of my veg with a dilute version of this. So there's all kinds of different fertilizers as well. Just know the smaller your container, the likelihood that you have to add nutrients to keep your plants thriving. Okay. Within your pot, you can use trellises too. So say I was putting a tomato in here. I could use one of these tomato trellises, put it in right to the bottom, and then this will help with vertical growth. And the tomato will like spill out of the trellis, but if you're using that vertical space, you want to have some sort of wooden stake or trellising materials to help support those plants. I brought my watering jug. It all depends on what you have. I also have like a juice jug that I use for some of my smaller pots. Like it's a hot pink plastic jug that I fill up with water. You know, you can use a hose that's connected to your building, whatever you have, but just make sure water is a super important resource to have. Okay, let's start talking about the plants and whatnot. So Natalie, if you can focus on those. It's typically cheaper to start your food crops from seed, but it depends what it is. Some things like tomatoes, some of them take 120 days to grow. And so you probably want to do some research on the crops that you want to grow and eat, and then what their growth habit is. And also things like carrots, looking for varieties that do well in small spaces and containers. So these are those Parisian carrots. They're small and round, and they don't need a lot of soil depth. And then I like these ones too. They're called Little Finger, and they're like a half size carrot. I wouldn't consider them a baby carrot, but they only need, 4 or 5 inches of soil, and those tend to do really great. Radishes, you can just grow them pretty much anywhere, and they don't take very much time. So seed companies typically have seed catalogs that you can order from the company, and they are an absolute wealth of information. And I forgot to bring one today to show you, but it's literally a catalog that has all the different crops and all the different varieties within those crops. Seed packages, though, like you can buy seeds pretty much at any hardware store, garden center, big box stores. If you look at the back, let me find a good one. They have tons of information on the back. Let me get my glasses. So you can get a lot of your planting information here. It tells you when to sow outside, when to start inside if you're growing them as transplants to plant later in your garden, any special germination instructions, and then it tells you typically how many days until emergence, like how many days it's going to take to germinate, what depth to plant the seeds at, seed spacing, so how far apart they need to be, row spacing. And so that's really important information depending on what you're growing and the variety of that as well. So sometimes I just order seed catalogs, which is super helpful because they have these charts that tell you how to grow, when to grow, etc. So remember that seed catalogs and seed packets have an absolute wealth of information on them. I also brought a pair of gloves, but a lot of times I just use my hands to garden. So these are some of the plants that I brought. Is this okay standing here?
Yeah.
That would do really great in containers. And for instance, I'm just going to move these over here. You can buy different sizes of transplants too. So these are both lemon thyme. This one is in, I mean, the plants are a little bit different size. This is in like a 2x2 container, and this one is in a larger, probably like a 3x3 container. And so if you were planting a small, say we're going to plant this with a bunch of herbs, you might want smaller plants. You can fit more in. Um, you also want to know how big the plants are going to get. So this thyme plant is probably going to get this big. So it potentially could fill up the whole pot, or you could plant it on the side with something else. But it's, going to get a lot bigger than this. So you can buy different sizes of transplants. And then you can also find things that do well. Like this is a zucchini plant that does well in containers. And it says right on the label, great for containers. So if you're growing in small spaces, there's a lot of diversity now, which is great. This is a cucumber patio snacker, the variety, and it matures in 55 days. So it says right on the label that it produces short branching vines and it's high yielding. So there's also lots of information on the plant labels as well. Lettuce always does really great. So this is a bunch of mixed lettuce. Does really great in pots, and you can either cut it when it gets big enough. I mean, this is literally, it hasn't been planted out yet, but you could cut this off and make a salad. Don't cut it off too low, and then more leaves will grow. And so it can be cut and come again, or you can just grow it as a head of lettuce, and when it's big enough, you cut it off, and then you could replant that space with something else. I found a few tomatoes. This is called grape tomato ruby crush, and it says a compact grape tomato, great for containers. So you just want to look at the labels and pick ones that are going to do well in a small space. This one's called tomato dwarf lemon ice, also great for small space gardens and containers. So we're so lucky now that they're developing different varieties that do well in small spaces. And then this is, I like the name of this, red rosy basil. This would look good in a container mixed with other things because it has this nice purple leaves. And so that adds a bit of diversity. I brought this. This is called the lemon verbena plant. And the leaves, when you rub them and smell them, they just smell heavenly like lemon. This plant looks tiny, but it actually will be about 4 feet tall. Sorry, it says it grows 6 feet tall, so 1.8 meters. So you have to read the labels because if you planted this in one of your little pots, it's going to be taller than me by the end of the season. So thinking about, your space and where things are at is really important, and also what you're going to eat and what you're going to enjoy. Like my household, we don't eat a lot of Swiss chard, and I grow it in our flower beds because it looks beautiful. And this year, one of my goals is to figure out how, and we've eaten it all the ways. It's just not a favorite, but we're going to try because we might as well, benefit from the food growing in our flower gardens. Yeah. I also brought a couple more plants. These are bush beans. Bush beans do great in pots. Sometimes they flop over the side, but it's amazing how much production you can get. Typically, you don't see bean plants as plant starts. You plant them from seed. And so I just thought this was kind of cool because it's like, ready to go to plant in your container. And this is a nasturtium plant, and these are super good for pollinators. So they have these nice flowers. They're edible flowers. They're spicy. They taste kind of peppery. And so these are really nice mixed in because they add, some nice visual effect, and you can eat the leaves and the flowers on them as well. So it's fun to have sort of multi-purpose plants in your plantings that, they're going to bring in the bumblebees and the pollinators and also look nice, and you can eat them too. This, our little bush baby zucchini. One thing I wanted to say is that this one has a leaf that doesn't look so great. Sometimes I look in garden centers, they have clearance sections, and a lot of times those plants look pretty rough. But a plant like this, it has one leaf, well, two leaves that don't look so great. But the main part of this plant is super healthy, and it's green and it's thriving and it's growing well. And so don't be scared of those plants either, but definitely do a little bit of research to make sure that you're buying something that's going to be productive. A lot of times I see clearance plants in garden centers like broccoli or cabbage or cauliflower, and they've been super stressed out that they're already starting to produce a flower head. That's the part that we eat, and those are not good to buy. But, herbs, you can give them a haircut, give them a trim, and they'll just keep growing. There's a lot of ways. Ask your neighbors to share their herbs, of getting plants at low cost as well. So, are there any questions?
We do have a comment.
Okay.
Someone said they had a purple basil, but it died on them.
Oh.
It had some white layer on the roots when it died.
Okay.
Roots were okay. It didn't look like aphids.
And can that person elaborate when they planted it? So basil is a heat lover, does not like cool weather or having wet roots for very long. So it might have been a seasonal issue, or there might have been something in the soil, some sort of fungus or something that did not work well with the basil.
They got it from a food market, so probably grocery store.
Oh, huh. Well, I'm afraid I can't identify that. There's all kinds of pathogens and things out there. I would say try again though. And purple basil, I love purple basil, how it looks when it's growing, and it smells so good. And it looks great in salads, but I made pesto out of it one time, and that was kind of an interesting color because typically, the leaves are really purple on purple basil. So, but it's good that the person growing that, looked at the roots. It's always good if your plant isn't thriving to sort of do a deep dive and try to figure out if it's environmental, if it was a pest or a pathogen. If it had something growing on the roots, that might have been something in the soil. Yeah. Yeah, good question.
So someone asked if they can grow cauliflower in container.
So brassicas in general, I would say kale, especially dwarf varieties of kale, do well in containers. It's a little harder to grow broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. Cauliflower is a little bit, what's the word? Like it needs really consistent water. The plants grow quite large. So you need a big pot or plant it on the side of a big pot because the plant's going to probably get, at least 1.5 2 feet wide. So that's one of the issues with growing brassicas in containers is they like really consistent water. So you have to stay up on the watering, and they take up a lot of space. So, but you can grow them in raised beds. You can grow them in if you had like a really big pot, maybe I'll try that this summer. I'll try to grow like a cabbage plant in a pot. It's the size restriction. So instead of getting one head of cauliflower, you could grow 5 different things in that space. Yeah. So it's the space constraints, growing in containers, and then they need more management. Yeah, that's a good question though. And some people have asked me, like, can I grow corn in a container? You totally could grow corn in a container, but they're super heavy. Corn's a super heavy feeder, so you'd have to fertilize it a lot, and they use a lot of water. So you'd have to water it a lot. And when you think of the production, so you could have, like in this big green pot, let's say, you always want to grow corn in a bunch too, because they pollinate each other. And so say you have 4 or 5 plants, the plants are going to be probably 5 or 6 feet tall. And then the amount of corn, so maybe each plant has 2 cobs on it. You're going to get 10 cobs of corn from this pot with a lot of labor, right? Fertilizing, watering, etc. As compared to, say, I've planted a pizza pot before where I've had a tomato, some basil, maybe an oregano plant, all sorts of different things. And the production of that was really high too. So you just, think about if you really love cauliflower, I say go for it, but baby that container and that plant, because they're a little bit persnickety. Yeah, that's a good question.
Questions in the chat so far.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions at all about starting to garden, container gardening, what to plant, feel free to ask here, or you can contact me at a later time as well. And the video recording of this will be available to everyone. And I'm going to be sending a couple of resources, just basics of veggie gardening, which will be useful to you all as well. Yeah.
Somebody says, can you mention eggshell, dust, coffee? I'm assuming for compost.
So other additives. So there was a question about using eggshells, coffee grounds. So you can definitely use eggshells. I just did a compost class last night, so this is very relevant. You want to either dry out the eggshells in your oven before you apply them on the surface or within your soil, because eggshells can harbor E. coli and salmonella. Especially, you have to be careful if you're using them in a food growing situation. And coffee grounds, you can definitely put a few in your soil mix, but not too many, just because they can be really acidic. And your growing medium or your soil, you want to keep it as close to a neutral pH as possible. So when you purchase growing mediums like in bags like these, usually it's at a good pH. Over time, though, with all the watering and precipitation that we get, it's good to either replace some of that soil or add a little bit of limestone. But you can definitely add things like eggshells and coffee grounds, just not too much. Someone told me last night that they use eggshells around their plants to help with slugs. We have a lot of slug and snail issues, so that might help with that issue too.
When tea leaves, like use tea leaves, and those be used.
So can you use tea leaves? I think anything in moderation that's organic is fine. Those things might also be good in a compost pile or Like mixing it into a large volume of soil is fine. You're adding organic matter, but just not too much. Yeah,
And then
good question.
someone mentioned they are in California. They planted grapes, finally getting a crop.
Great.
However, they are small, about the size of your pinky nail.
Yeah.
They be champagne grapes, and can you eat them?
So someone is growing grapes in California, said they're getting a crop. Yay, because it always takes a while to get a perennial crop. They're small but they taste good, correct?
Yeah, can they be champagne grapes and can you eat them?
So can they be champagne grapes? Can you eat them? Yeah. So I apologize, I can't identify your grape here. Typically, if they taste good, you can eat them. I did my graduate work in vineyards, and some varietals don't taste great fresh, but they're still edible. Or at home, we have cider apples in our orchard, and you can eat them, but they don't taste that great. So it depends on your preference. If they taste good, you can eat them. Small size could be determined by the variety that they are. And typically there's like around here, it's called a tree fruit society, but there might be like a grape grower society or group of people that do identification that you could send your grapes there and they could identify them to variety. So it might be varietal or it might be growing conditions because some grapevines, if they're not getting enough, I mean, grapevines don't need a lot of nutrients. They're not heavy feeders or water. Sometimes they'll produce less fruit and smaller fruit. So it could be a combo of a few things, but I would recommend trying to find some grape growers that could help identify what the variety is. And then that would indicate, typical size, typical yield and things like that. Yeah, good question. Yay for getting a crop though. That's exciting.
Someone also asked if you recommend composting into your raised vegetable beds. They made large tubes with drill holes, fill as needed with veggie scraps, dirt, dry material. Sounds like it's going directly into
Yeah.
the bed.
So the question was, can you compost right in your raised beds? And I've seen examples of this where it's kind of like a cone or a cylinder that you place inside the bed within the soil, and then you add organic matter and food waste and food scraps and things to that. And so it composts sort of in situ and provides nutrients for the rest of the bed. I would say to be careful about moisture. So make sure that you're adding brown materials, like dry materials, like leaves or straw or shredded newspaper, things like that, so that it doesn't get too wet because sometimes it can get a bit stinky and then you can start attracting things like rats and mice and critters that you probably don't want in your veggie beds. But yeah, I haven't seen, I've been made aware of those and they sound super handy. I think just managing the composting part of it so that you're not attracting critters that might want to eat your vegetables or eat your strawberries that you have growing in there. But yeah, why not? I mean, anytime you're composting, you're taking that food waste out of the landfill cycle. So that's good for the environment and more sustainable. Mm-hmm.
And then someone asked, do you use bone meal when planting your vegetables?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So is it good to use bone meal when you plant your vegetables? So bone meal is a good source of nutrients and calcium. Typically, when I plant my tomatoes, and I forgot to say this, when you plant tomatoes, the more stem that you plant, so if I planted this, I would cut this branch off, this branch off, take all this stuff off, and I would plant it right up to here. You could even plant it right up to here because there's all these little hairs along the stem. Those are going to turn to roots. So if you plant your tomato deeper, all of this will become root system and you'll have a more robust plant, right, that can take up nutrients and water. Before I plant, and this is a personal choice, my tomatoes, I always put a little bit of bone meal in the bottom of the planting hole with some compost. Because that just helps with the general well-being and nutritional status of the tomato. But there's all kinds of other meals like cottonseed meal, kelp meal, blood meal. A lot of folks use bone meal with tomatoes in particular, though, because some tomatoes are susceptible to, it's called blossom end rot, which is a calcium deficiency, but actually it is related to water uptake and some other things. So using bone meal won't necessarily fix blossom end rot, but it's a way of adding more nutrients to your soil. And the last thing I want to say about bone meal is that it can also attract, it doesn't attract pests like blood meal does, but I think it smells good to rodents in particular. And so when I put it in my planting holes, it's deep, deep down and mixed with compost. So I've never had issues, but it's just one thing to think about. Yeah, good question.
Someone did ask if the occasional rat visits, do you need to sterilize anything? Sure.
If the occasional rat visit, yeah.
Your compost that says, do you need to sterilize anything?
So sterilize, I'm not sure what you, if a rat visited, the question was, would you need to sterilize? I mean, you'll have like some visitors to your garden. I would say if you see excrement or signs of, waste products from those, you don't want to eat things with, if a rat like pooped on a tomato or something, you don't want to eat that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So they said, do you need to wash with something before consuming? I'm assuming.
If you have rats in your garden and they're within your crop production, do you need to wash? Yes, it's a good idea. Yeah. And also if you're cooking things, there's a difference between lettuce, which you don't ever eat cooked typically. If you see pests, like rodent activity, you probably don't want to eat things that have been exposed to rodents. But if you're cooking, like if you have tomatoes, you could wash the tomatoes and then cook them in a sauce, and that would reduce the risk. Yeah. Good question. Thanks, everybody. Any last questions? All right. So thanks to Stilly Valley Health Connections for the great space to teach the class. If folks have questions, definitely reach out, and you'll be hearing from folks here with the video recording and resources. So thanks for joining us.